Welcome to the Four Worlds podcast from Tomorrow's World Today. We're diving into the latest in tech, science, and sustainability, from nature's mysteries in the world of inspiration to the hands-on crafts of creation, the bold breakthroughs of innovation, and the scaled-up wonders of production. This is your ticket to the stories shaping tomorrow. All right, welcome into another episode of the Four Worlds podcast. Nature and art collide today, and artist and naturalist Gabriel Willow joins us today with an interesting perspective on nature, urban settings, and a love for art. Gabriel, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, we're excited to have you. Of course, that's a very simple way to put what you do, who you are. Let us know who Gabriel is. Give us a little background of what you do and how you kind of got here.
Sure, yeah. So I mostly refer to myself as an urban naturalist. So I'm exploring nature in urban settings. I'm based in New York City. A lot of my programs are here, although I also lead trips beyond the 5 boroughs of New York City and even abroad. But basically, there's a lot of different facets. Mm-hmm. Mostly I'm a tour guide, so I design programs and tours, but they can take a lot of different forms. I do walking tours in city parks. I do boat-based tours around New York City on the rivers, the Hudson River, the East River. But then I've also collaborated in art exhibitions that are about nature in cities and sort of coexisting with, humanity. Art's been a little on the back burner for me lately, but I do also draw and paint. And I've also collaborated with other artists. I mean, I've done projects that are about nature, but may have a dance component. Or last summer, I collaborated with a choreographer who was doing a dance piece that was about fireflies. And so there was a firefly walk where we looked for actual fireflies, but then all these dancers who emerged as it was getting dark, and they were holding lights and doing a dance that was inspired by fireflies. And so I really love collaboration when possible. And I've been lucky to collaborate with a lot of interesting composers, painters, dancers, choreographers, and stuff like that. So it takes all different forms, but ultimately it's about connecting people with nature, particularly in cities.
Yeah, just like you said, kind of combining the urban aspect, the urban environment, and nature. What kind of got that started for you? How are you inspired, and why is that so important for people that may live in concrete jungles?
Yeah, well, I actually grew up in a very rural area in rural Maine, but my folks, my parents are from this area. My mom's from Brooklyn. My dad was from New Jersey, and my grandparents were from Staten Island. So I had a long-term New York connection via family in Brooklyn, family in Staten Island, family in Jersey. So I would come to the city a lot when I was a kid, and I was always really fascinated by just, everything that makes New York City what it is, the hustle and the bustle and the subways and all the people. And this was really kind of where I always imagined myself ending up. And sure enough, I did. Even though my parents moved away from the city to live in the country, I kind of came right back once I graduated college. But having grown up in a rural area, I was also really a nature kid and spent a lot of time outdoors. For my folks, they thought of cities as these polluted kind of places where there wasn't really much nature, and they were farmers. Where I grew up, we grew most of our own food and had a big garden and chickens and goats and stuff. And so they were kind of part of that back to the land movement. But I sort of had a different opinion where I thought cities are actually inherently quite sustainable, maybe the most sustainable way for people to live, because, if you're in an apartment building, it's more efficient to heat and cool it than if you're in a series of separate houses. You don't have to drive cars here. I've never owned a car in my life, and that's much more sustainable. And there's just a number of aspects in which I think urban living is a better answer to a sustainability question. Right. But also I love wildlife and nature. And I do think there's this perception that you don't have much of that in urban settings, but I was really fascinated just to see what rich biodiversity there is in cities. And so that's something I chose to sort of highlight for other people who may also not be aware how much there is. And so, you go to city parks here and they're full of birds. You can find edible or medicinal plants you can forage for in cracks in the sidewalk or in city parks. I mean, maybe you wouldn't want to eat some of those plants depending on, you might want to find out what the heavy metals content of the soil is or something like that. But, I know this little spot in a cemetery near me where there's native the American persimmon trees. And if you go between like October and December, you can find these delicious persimmons just like all over the ground, just little things like that. You can find all these interesting plants, and then these firefly walks in the summer. And for a lot of wildlife, the city is actually more conducive sometimes to them thriving, surviving. Like New York City, for example, has less pesticide use than an agricultural region would, or suburban area where people put a lot of pesticides on their lawns.
Mm-hmm.
And so insects tend to thrive in many cities, although there's other challenges for them, like light pollution, how like moths famously come to porch lights or whatever. But just think, in a city that's full of street lamps and skyscrapers, the light pollution issue is an even bigger issue for them. But then on the other hand, like I said, there's fewer pesticides. And so it's maybe more hospitable in certain respects and less so in others for insects, for example.
Yeah, I'm interested in your work because your work kind of, touches into this. And we could talk about that later, since, of course, you said you kind of put art on your work and your art on the back burner, which is fine. Hopefully this kind of, makes, try to get back out there, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully this kind of gives you a little more inspiration. But I am interested in your angle of like green spaces and nature in urban areas, urban settings where people might not expect it. How important it is for someone that may be living in more of an urban area or a big city to kind of go out and find those green spaces and connect themselves with nature wherever it's possible, whether it is just kind of looking at the weeds or whatever growing in the cracks of the sidewalk. How important is that, connecting in nature in an environment where it's least expected?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, again, I think cities are inherently fairly sustainable in terms of like resource usage and space allotment. Like if you took, the 8 million people in New York City and had them at a lower density that you have in suburbs or rural areas, that would mean losing lots of forest, or, what I mean? Like if you spread all these folks out over a greater area, and we're all packed into a very small area here. And I think that's a sustainable way of living in a lot of ways. And again, public transit is huge for sustainability. And we have, the best public transit in the country here. But at the same time, I do think it's really crucial for people to have a connection to the natural world. Edward O. Wilson, the great, entomologist and biologist who was at Harvard, proposed this idea of biophilia, which was this innate human need for a connection with nature. And that could take many forms. It might be having goldfish or something, or a house plant, but we do need to have some connection with other life forms. So I think exploring nature in the city, the purpose is kind of twofold. I mean, one, it's to understand better the nature that's here from a conservation standpoint, and to recognize that cities are really can be really important areas for wildlife and trees and whatnot. But also, I think it's important for the people involved to have a greater connection to nature. And it is true that sometimes, I imagine if you live in the countryside, you might just have more opportunity to step outside and look around and see trees and see these landscapes. That I think it is really good for one's health. I think there are proven health benefits. Studies have shown that
absolutely
spending time in nature reduces symptoms of ADHD, reduces stress, lowers the cortisol levels in our bodies, improves all sorts of mental health outcomes. So there's all these things that are really important for people. And I feel like there's justice aspect to people having access to nature. But again, in New York City, we're very lucky to have a number of really spectacular parks, and that people heavily utilize. But I do think also, I often look at Central Park is obviously incredibly famous, but one can also find a lot of interesting nature in just abandoned places. It could be a vacant lot, it could be, or a community garden, or the waterfront around the city. And in New York City, there's a much greater connection to the waterfront than there used to be. It used to be the waterfront was fairly inaccessible. Often there would be some chain link fence that would be industrial usage, or there's some highway cutting people off from the waterfront. And in the last 25 years or so, they've created a lot more parks along the waterfront. And so I do feel like there's increasing opportunities for people to connect with nature, but sometimes you do need to sort of help show folks what's there. And if you look more, it's really just about looking closely. And I've made a practice recently of going up on my roof. I have roof access in my building in Brooklyn, and just staring out at the sky or at the harbor and looking for interesting birds every morning. And I've seen so many amazing things. I've seen bald eagles on multiple occasions. I've seen flocks of migrating sandhill cranes overhead, which I had never seen in New York City.
Yeah.
There's very few records of sandhill cranes like landing in the city, but I saw like twice in 2 weeks, I saw some fly over. So I think there's also more than people realize. But if you
Yeah.
take the time to go and like just stare at the sky,
Yeah.
you'll start seeing things. And similarly, if you got down close and started looking at what kind of plants are in the tree pits, they have these street trees, but if you look around the base of the tree, there's little weeds and things growing there. Who knows what kind of, rare or fascinating wildflowers or edible plants or, what have you is growing there, or little insect populations. It's just all this stuff can be really fascinating. And to have a meaningful connection with nature, you don't have to go to a national park. You don't have to go to the Grand Canyon. You could just crouch down and look really closely at a bee that's on a dandelion or something. And it can be just as moving and of an experience, I think.
Yeah, and I think where a lot of that comes from is just kind of general curiosity, right? Just taking that time to look outside and just wonder, what's out there, no matter where you live, outside, as simple as this sounds, always exists, right?
Yeah.
So just having that general curiosity, and it sounds like that's something that you kind of heavily promote, is just kind of looking outside, even if it is just the common robin around here, or even in New York City, the pigeon, just just exploring that and just kind of looking a little harder than usual.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And right. I mean, that's something I've often said too, is maybe you're seeing some rare creature, or maybe you're seeing a super common creature, but an unusual behavior that you never saw before.
Sure.
And right, it could be a pigeon, but suddenly you're like, wow, I never realized that pigeons did this or that other thing. I was in Tompkins Square Park on the Lower East Side some years ago and saw a pigeon strutting around with a piece of bread, like someone was probably tossing just sliced sandwich bread out, but it had pecked and pecked at the center of the bread, so there was a hole, and then it had like tossed the bread up and over, and it was wearing it around its neck. And I was like, is this pigeon trapped in a piece of bread? Was this intentional?
Fashion statement.
And then, is it a fashion statement? Is it a smart way to carry this food around? Because it would fly, it would take off wearing a piece of bread around its neck. And then I saw another pigeon doing it, and then another pigeon. I saw like 3 or 4 pigeons flying around carrying bread. I'm like, is this a new behavior we're witnessing here of like fashion statement and mobile snack
efficiency? Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Maybe other pigeons coming in, taking a piece of it.
It seemed like too much to be a coincidence. I'm like, surely I did one pigeon see another pigeon doing that and was like, oh, that's a good idea. I don't know.
Yeah.
But you just never know what you're going to find,
Maybe it could be just even for birds. They don't like the crust either. Kids growing up, they want the crust cut off.
Eating the center, right?
Yeah. So again, taking all of this into consideration, just being a little more curious, going outside, looking up it. And I do want to talk a little bit about your work, because one thing that, fascinated me, your drawings of extinct species in urban settings was really fascinating to me. Just like the passenger pigeon just chilling in New York City, something you might not obviously can't see now. Where did that inspiration come from? What kind of message does that send?
Yeah, so that was a specific series I did called Ecologiac, and which is a portmanteau of ecology and elegiac, sort of mourning something that we've lost. And that was exploring this idea of adaptation, of how certain species adapt to urban settings. And so today, like I said, from my roof, I've seen multiple bald eagles, and that's a species that we nearly lost. I mean, the bald eagle population at its nadir was maybe 5,000 birds, mostly just in Alaska and a few in Florida. And we nearly wiped them out with the use of DDT, a pesticide to control mosquitoes. And so the fact that they're flourishing here, and there's another species, the peregrine falcon, amazing, fastest animal on Earth, was also almost wiped out by pesticide use. And now today, New York City has the highest population densities of peregrine falcons in the world. Mm-hmm. So I got to thinking about how urban places, and New York City specifically, can really, again, be refugia for species that are quite rare, although they've made amazing comebacks, and so they're no longer particularly rare. But it got me thinking, well, what would have happened if we hadn't lost this number of species that went extinct? In the continental U.S., we luckily haven't lost that many species, and most of the ones we did lose was in from the mid 19th century to the early 20th century, when there was completely unregulated hunting and a lot of habitat loss. A lot of forests were getting cut down. So we lost a number of really iconic species back then. The passenger pigeon, as you mentioned, the great auk, which was this huge flightless sort of cousin of a puffin that looked more like a penguin. The Labrador duck, the heath hen, which was a sort of prairie chicken that lived in the Northeast. And most of these were being hunted for food. The great auk was hunted for oil. They would render the fat of these seabirds, which had a protective layer of fat, to keep them warm in the cold North Atlantic. And they were used for lamp oil, sort of the way that whales were during the whaling era.
Right.
But I got to thinking, well, gee, if they had never gone extinct, would they have adapted, and would they be species that would actually flourish in New York City the way that some of these other species that we nearly lost do today?
Yeah.
So that series was superimposing drawings. I did transparent vellum over photos of the modern city. So it was sort of this ghostly apparition of species we lost, but living now in Union Square or in Prospect Park or other areas. And because I do think about that, sometimes I'm bird watching, and, I've seen some pretty rare birds around New York Harbor, and it's like, oh, what if there had been this Labrador duck that never went extinct and it was bobbing around in New York Harbor and birdwatchers came to see it, what would that be like? So that's what that series was exploring, this sort of alternate reality.
Yeah, it is really fascinating. I encourage anyone listening to go check that out because, one, I mean, you're an incredible artist. Your drawing abilities were very impressive, for one thing. But just that concept, I just found extremely fascinating, and I encourage anyone listening to go check that out. We talk about birds, and we have been. What sparked that deep connection? As a urban naturalist and an artist, what sparked that interest and deep connection to birds?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, birds are the aspect of the natural world maybe that first get them interested in nature and noticing more about it. Bird watching is the most popular outdoor hobby. It's actually more popular than golf or fly fishing, at least if you use a fairly general definition of bird watching, like maybe just having a bird feeder in your backyard, or not necessarily people who are traveling all over trying to see the most birds. But yeah, I think it's very accessible. You don't need a lot of specialized equipment. Maybe some binoculars and a field guide. There's a lot of free apps now for smartphones that help you identify birds. So there's an accessible quality that I think is very democratizing, which I really appreciate. And then for me personally, I don't know, actually. I when I was little, I remember doing a little carpentry project, building a little bird feeder when I was a little kid with my dad and putting it up in a tree up in Maine. And nothing happened. Like, we put bird seed and I was staring out there. I thought birds would show up immediately.
Yeah,
and
got more squirrels than anything.
Yeah, it takes them a while to recognize anything new in their environment. Yeah. It may have taken a week. It felt interminable at the time, but eventually, some chickadees found it, and I was just so excited. There was these wild birds coming in and taking seeds, from this little bird feeder I built, and that was really the moment for me that just got me fascinated. And I had a little pair of opera glasses that had been my grandmother's, and was just like looking out the window with these little mother of pearl opera glasses or whatever, and yeah, I think birds, they really engage a lot of the senses. They're colorful, they sing. I mean, even someone who is blind could appreciate birds because they have beautiful song. So there's a lot of different ways to engage with them. And they're also super adaptable, and you can find them pretty much in any habitat on Earth. I mean, from the hottest deserts to Antarctica, and certainly in cities. New York is on I keep referring to New York because it's where I live, but a lot of this would apply sort of anywhere.
Absolutely.
But New York City is on the Atlantic Migratory Flyway, which is one of the major migratory flyways of the U.S. There's also a central flyway that's more or less the Mississippi River Valley. And there's a smaller flyway along the east side of the Rocky Mountains. And then there's a Pacific flyway. So for Pittsburgh, for example, I imagine it's more birds going up the central flyway, and then they kind of fan out, so they might come up the Mississippi Valley and then move into their breeding territories. But a lot of birds do follow the Atlantic coast. And so we get a ton of birds in New York City. I mean, it's really a spring day in Central Park can be the best place to be, at that time of year in the world, just about. I mean, so much color and sound and diversity. Central Park, they've recorded over 300 species of birds.
That's unbelievable.
Since I've been going up on my roof, there used to be an alarm on my roof, very loud, and it was mysteriously disabled, which is great. Now I can go out there. So I've only been going out there on the roof for less than a year. But I'm up to 85 species just from my roof of bird, including some pretty rare ones like those sandhill cranes. And so, I feel like, I have a friend who doesn't even have roof access, but they just have a little bit of, they have, I think, a small balcony, and they can see a little bit of sky in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. And they've also seen dozens and dozens of species, including some pretty rare ones so it's about just looking more closely and having that, being more attuned to what's out there. And, it's challenging to not everybody can maybe identify all these birds it takes a lot of practice, But I do often encounter folks who certainly are stopped in their tracks when they see a red-tailed hawk, on a lamppost eating a pigeon or something. Like, that's a real kind of National Geographic moment.
Yeah.
I see footage on Instagram or whatever of like a red-tailed hawk that lands on the roof of a taxi cab or something that's parked, and it's eating a rat, and everybody stops and looks, and I love that. It's really engaging for folks.
Yeah, we actually interviewed an artist a couple weeks ago, kind of just talking about birds. Funny enough, I think some of the appeal actually is not stressing over knowing the species. It kind of adds to the fun if you see a bird that you've never seen before and giving it kind of your own name, the spotted blue bird or something like that. Just kind of having them and just not to answer the question for you that I asked, but I think a lot of it too is kind of accessibility. I mean, birds are everywhere,
Exactly.
Like you said, you just kind of have to look out and not that that's where your deep connection with your art and your interests have come from, but I think just for the common person, the accessibility of bird watching is there, whether you're on a rooftop in Brooklyn or a field in Missouri or what have you.
Exactly. And and one can spend a bunch of money and go to the Galapagos or go to Antarctica, but you don't really have to, I mean, it's funny because now I do lead international trips, and I have led trips to the Galapagos and the Amazon, but historically I was much more of an advocate for just getting to know where you are. Like, my whole line always used to be that you don't have to go to these exotic places. You can just walk down your block in New York City and you can see all kinds of cool stuff. And then now I am leading trips to those places, and I'm like, all right, it's pretty cool going to the Galapagos, but but if you don't have the means, to do so, or the time or whatever, I mean, it's very expensive. There is a lot that can be discovered here. And I also think, the whole topic of technology and how we now interact with our phones and screens and the extent to which that's separating us from the world is a whole nother topic. But that being said, there are some amazing free tools that are available now that I've found quite really revolutionizing in certain ways. There's a free app called iNaturalist that you can upload a photo of pretty much anything in the natural world: a fungus, a feather, a bird, an insect, a flower. And it has an algorithm that's based on probably originally on some pretty creepy like facial recognition surveillance software, but it's using it for good. It's like, oh, what if we took this surveillance software and turned it towards categorizing flowers and bugs, And so it has an algorithm that initially identifies it, but then what's even cooler is there's a community of folks. It's open source, and so then people can weigh in and be like, oh, I think it's this kind of bee or that type of wildflower. And usually the people who do weigh in know what they're talking about. So like, there's a guy who used to be the bee expert at the Museum of Natural History in New York. Now he's based in Singapore. But whenever I upload a bee sighting to iNaturalist, he usually weighs in with an ID, because I think he's still like kind of misses New York City and is interested in what's being seen here. So he'll probably gets flagged when there's a bee sighting in New York City, and he'll weigh in with his ID. And I think that's really great. And like you said, whether you put a name to something or not necessarily important. You can have a really meaningful experience with wildlife without knowing what it is. But I do feel like there's a certain power in categorizing things, and in a sense that you realize how much more diversity there is. So like, if you just see a little brown bird, you can say it's a little brown bird. Cool. Maybe then you reach another level where you're like, oh, that's a sparrow, but you think they're all just sparrows.
Right.
Or the same sparrow. And then you reach another level and you're like, wait a minute, there's house sparrows and song sparrows and chipping sparrows and white-throated sparrows. And so it's sort of like iterative, and you keep seeing more and more detail, and it just makes the world richer and richer. So there's like a certain nerdy aspect to getting bogged down in this quantification, but at the same time, there's an aspect in which it enlarges the world and makes it seem more complex and interesting. So I do think there's a certain power in that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very well said. It really shows you how, like you said, diverse and big the world is. Obviously, we know that, our even New York City on a grand scale is small, know, and so it does just kind of broaden that view. And just with, again, talking about all of this, you are an artist, but of course now you're into the guiding and the, being the urban naturalist that you are. How do you combine all of this? How does your hands-on experience as a naturalist and a guide, being physically immersed in that environment, inform your artistic eye and your choices when you do, sit down and try to create something?
Yeah, I guess I'm still trying to figure that out too.
Yeah, hey,
Like how
that's all right.
how to combine the artistic interests and the guiding and the science. I mean, I will say part of why I don't make quite as much art as I used to
Mhm.
is that it does require a certain amount of reflection and
Mhm.
free time and space, like studio space or what have you. And the more I get into guiding, and particularly now that I'm doing like international trips that are logistically fairly complicated, then I have
Mhm.
less free time to sort of sit and
Right.
ponder and sketch and do some of the art stuff. So I'm still trying to find that balance myself. I mean, I do feel like, that Ecolesiac project I mentioned was probably about 10 years ago now. And I do feel like that was one of my series or pieces that sort of best integrated a lot of my interests and thoughts.
Mhm.
And yeah, I guess, but I also don't really see necessarily much of a distinction between it all. Like whether I'm leading a walking tour and telling people about some interesting facts about nature, or
Mhm.
whether I'm creating some art that explores some of these ideas,
Yeah.
they're all sort of just different ways to explore similar themes.
Mhm.
And so at the end of the day, it doesn't feel to me that the medium is the most important thing. I do love art and I would like to make more art again, particularly collaborative. I mean, there's an amazing project in Manhattan called the Audubon Mural Project, where it's started up in Harlem, where John James Audubon lived at one time. And he was, well, a controversial figure because he was problematic in a number of ways, but he was an amazing painter of birds. So the Audubon Mural Project was sponsored by the National Audubon Society, and it's street murals of different birds that are threatened by climate change.
Mhm.
Not my project, but they have asked on a couple occasions if I want to do one, and
Mhm.
I haven't taken that on yet. But there's definitely things out there, opportunities that I could
Yeah.
pursue. Yeah. But now I have this new project, which is I
Yeah.
recently purchased some land in Ecuador where there's a small eco lodge. And so I want to explore that. I want to see how I could maybe create like artists in residence program there,
Cool.
where artists could come down and be in the cloud forest in Ecuador, and maybe also have scientists come and stay there. And so it sort of be like a real world equivalent of, say, that iNaturalist app, where maybe you have an orchid expert or a bee expert. This part of the cloud forest has the highest biodiversity of orchids in the world, the most types of frogs in the world. It's a extremely biodiverse area. So I like the idea of potentially bringing people together. They could come and
Yeah.
stay at this lodge, and maybe you could have artists and scientists sitting down over meals and sharing ideas and finding ways to collaborate. So that's just very much in the beginning stages. I just started the process of, I signed the papers for the place in March. I'm headed down there in a few days actually, and I still need to really kind of meditate on it and
Yeah.
also look into finances and different things, try to figure out
Feasibility. Yeah.
logistics. Yeah, but that's something that I'm kind of daydreaming about right now.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, and I wish you the best of luck with that, because that does sound like a really cool idea. And not that I know of anything sort of like that, but it's an interesting concept where you kind of get these creators, naturalists like yourself, scientists, in kind of one space with, like you said, a lot of biodiversity. So that really is fascinating. What were some of those challenges? You can even put, your current venture with Ecuador, your land in Ecuador, or some of your tours, your guides, anything like that you've, found the most rewarding.
I guess the most rewarding thing is if I run into somebody who maybe, which happens. I mean, I've been doing nature programming around New York City for almost 25 years now. And not infrequently, I'll run into someone who remembers me. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, I did a program with you, years ago. I was at some, like, a little cocktail reception for a environmental nonprofit once, and there was different people there. And there's this woman who came up to me and she's like, oh, are you Gabriel Willow? And I said, yeah. And she's like, wow, I did a series of nature programs with you when I was in like junior high, and was an intern at this place in the Bronx. And we did, like a bug ID class, and we did a bird ID class and learned about trees. And she said, oh yeah, that really like had a big influence on me. And then she was working for an environmental nonprofit at that point. And she was like in her 30s, you know what I mean? and it was kind of cool. Like, oh wow, like I did that when you were in junior high and now you're in your 30s. That's pretty crazy. I feel old. But also it's rewarding, to hear that someone remembers that so many years later. And so, I've had different people tell me stuff like that. Like, oh yeah, you really changed how I saw the world around me, or I went into a conservation field, not entirely because I can't take all the credit, but like that is incredibly rewarding just to hear that I played some small role maybe in nurturing that interest or inspiring something there, or what have you. I mean, I assume also the fact that this person was already an intern or an apprentice at a place doing nature stuff was already there as an interest. I don't think I brought that interest about, but even so yeah, that's pretty satisfying to just inspire people in different ways and get people out there.
Having that impact and kind of, it's obviously it's not, not a thankless job, but you probably do all these tours, these guides and everything like that. Don't think anything of it, but hearing that impact, personally with someone, that's I can see how that's a good feeling, doing all of that. Well, I'll tell you what, Gabriel, I mean, this interview, you saw the questions that I had, and I love interviews like this where you kind of go in different directions, and we went down a couple different pathways that, I wasn't expecting to, and I really appreciate that. Is there anything else that you kind of wanted to tell people about, any sort of future works? How can they find you? How can they connect with you?
Well, I have a website, which I'm not always the best about updating, but it's just my name, which is Gabriel Willow. So it's gabrielwillow.com. And I guess you could include that maybe in the show notes somewhere in case people don't know how to spell my name. And like, for example, I don't have anything about the place in Ecuador up there yet because it's such a new thing, but I'm sure I will be adding more information about that in the future. And because I'm going to be there all winter, I don't really have any programs up on my website right now because I don't have anything scheduled yet for the spring when I'm back, but I will. I'll add those soon. But you can sign up for an email list on there, and I send like quarterly email updates with different things I have going on. If folks want to do that, they could stay in touch that way. Yeah,
that's great. And we would love to continue this connection as well. So anytime you find something interesting or anything of the sorts, feel free to, connect with us, and, we'll kind of
I appreciate that
working relationship going. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, Gabriel.
Well,
Gabriel, like I was just going to wrap up, thanks for taking the time in joining us today. This was really interesting.
Yeah, it was an honor. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, Gabriel, thank you. And thank you everyone for listening. That's all the time we have. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Four Worlds Podcast. Until next time, you can catch up on the latest innovations shaping our world at tomorrowsworldtoday.com. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel.